Okay, so welcome everybody. Today we're welcoming Dr. Zenas Yiu in our GlowDerm Trainee Committee webinar entitled "Should We Trust Clinical Practice Guidelines in Dermatology?" So thank you very much for your availability, Dr. Zenas. We're very excited for this lecture. Can you pass to the next slide, please? So today I'll be your host together with Aswan Tai from Australia. And first of all, we would like to present you a GlowDerm Trainee Committee. So who are we? We are the International Alliance for Global Health Dermatology, and our aim is to promote knowledge equity by improving access to education for dermatology trainees across the world. We aim to provide free educational events and opportunities to build networks and collaborate. Go ahead. So some meeting etiquette for you. Your audio will be muted and your camera will be turned off for the duration of this webinar. But if you have any questions or comments, please share via the chat function or the Q&A session. And our meeting host will share the questions with the speakers at the end of the webinar. We will also be sharing some information about the GlowDerm Trainee Committee in the chat function. So thank you very much, Dr. Zenas. You can go ahead and start your lecture.
Thank you, Louisa, and thank you to the GlowDerm Trainee Committee for inviting me to speak today. And I'm very impressed with all the social media stuff that you've been pushing out for this, and hopefully it'll live up to your expectations. So I am a clinical senior lecturer in dermatology and pharmacoepidemiology. I'm based in Manchester, which you can see in my background, and we've just been discussing. This is a false image. It's not usually like that. It's usually a little bit miserable, as it is today. So I am going to talk to you about clinical practice guidelines in dermatology, also known as guidelines. And really, we've done a little project in this space, and I'm going to talk to you generally about guidelines in terms of especially whether or not they're trustworthy and how can we tell which guidelines we should trust to follow. So this is my conflict of interest. I'm an associate editor for guidelines in the BJD evidence-based dermatology section. I've also been involved in some guidelines in the British Association of Dermatologists involving biologics in psoriasis and also the use of methotrexate as well. So when we think about guidelines in particular, we need to take ourselves back to the concept of following evidence in our practice as practitioners and even as patients. And so this really became more formal when David Sackett, who you may have heard of, really coined the term evidence-based medicine in the BMJ, and this is what he said. Evidence-based medicine is the conscientious, explicit, judicious use of current best evidence, making decisions about the care of individual patients. So it's really introducing the concept that we need to be updated with the current best evidence when we're making our decisions, but it also has this second approach or second part of the phrase, which means integrating individual clinical expertise with the best available external clinical evidence from systematic search. And it's really, the second part, which people struggle with. A lot of people find guidelines are a little bit too strict. It's hard to implement them. And it's that tension between how do you individually care for that patient, but also take into account the best available external evidence. And this is the really important part of evidence-based medicine. And I really like this cartoon from Hal Williams in Nottingham, which really exemplifies the actual false divide. There isn't this kind of divide where you have clinicians or patients who are stuck to EBM and these kind of methods with other clinicians who just want to do it their way and using kind of their own experience. It's kind of a mixture and a kind of merging of the two, really. Everybody practices evidence-based medicine to some degree. The problem with practicing evidence-based medicine is that it's very, very hard to keep on top of all the evidence. So I've just chosen psoriasis as an example, but you could use a whole load of other examples, really. And I did this search quite a while ago now, and it came up with about 60,000 results. And if we were to know how to use the best available evidence just for psoriasis, you would need to really know what's happening in all of these 60,000 studies, and I don't think that's possible for anyone. And as dermatologists, we don't deal with one disease, we deal with many different diseases. So how can we synthesize the best available evidence and take it into our clinical practice? And I'm sure you're all familiar with the evidence pyramid. And I think the traditional evidence pyramid is the one that you can see on the left. You have this kind of increasing in rigorous study types from the bottom of the pyramid right up to the top. You have case reports and case studies or case series, which are lowest kind of rank of evidence and maybe a little bit above expert opinion, and then you build up onto different more systematically robust study types into systematic reviews where you put studies together to come up with the overall evidence for this particular area. But then you also have further types of evidence to help us in trying to assimilate and put together this evidence. And so you have the kind of synopsis, and then what we're looking at here is the summaries and taking the evidence into recommendations, and the clinical practice guidelines along with textbooks and other things sit in this category. And so they really should be one of the highest levels of evidence that we can rely on and really help us kind of skip the hard work, really, in terms of looking at all the studies and trying to come up with some recommendations that we can follow directly. So what are clinical practice guidelines, or CPGs in short? So very usefully, the US have an Institute of Medicine who have come up with a lot of guidance in this space. And this is their formal definition. So guidelines, or CPGs, are statements that include recommendations intended to optimize patient care, informed, very importantly, by a systematic review of evidence, and then an assessment of the benefits and harms of alternative care options. It's really boiling down those that transition from the evidence to concrete recommendations that we can follow as clinicians to guide our clinical practice. And why do we need these? I think it's really important for evidence-based medicine, but specifically, it helps us reduce inappropriate practice variation. It helps us understand what it means by good quality of care and measuring performance with audits and other tools. It helps to take the research findings and translate those into our clinical practice. It helps improve healthcare quality and safety, and it's an education tool as well. It helps us educate our patients, caregivers, and also the media and policymakers. So it really fulfills quite a few different functions. This is why problems with CPGs can be wide-ranging and have a big impact. So this was a study by the IOM back in 1992, and these problems still exist to this day. So first of all, there are multiple organizations developing CPGs. Now, you may be most familiar with the guidelines that are in your particular country, if you have them. But there are also multiple guidelines across different countries and even, in different nations. And often these guidelines are based on the same evidence. And so you have multiple organizations spending a lot of time and effort and potentially funding to synthesize the same evidence to come up with the same or maybe slightly differing recommendations. And this process is pretty inefficient, and it can be overlapping and a waste of resources. There's also a wide variety in how good these guidelines were put together. So the development often lacked consistent methodological quality. They weren't supported by methodologists. This is a point we'll come on to later. This means that it's unclear, often unclear, for example, when they come up with the recommendations, what is the evidence behind the recommendation, how they came up with it. The recommendations often were based on expert opinion, so they failed to meet the needs of patients or take into account, for example, health care restrictions and implementation in different settings. Often unclear whether or not these recommendations did anything to improve the quality of care of patients. So specifically now, we're going to look at dermatology, which we're all interested in on this call. So being very interested in this space, I conducted a survey of readers of the British Journal of Dermatology, trying to understand what do stakeholders in dermatology want from guidelines. And these were the themes that came out of the survey. So they wanted high quality guidelines. They wanted guidelines that were put together using the best development and reporting standards. They wanted guidelines that were clear and succinct, not pages and pages of text, but really clear recommendations that you can take to the patient. They wanted better accessibility. They don't want it hidden in journals, behind paywalls. They want everybody to be able to just click on it and get to the recommendations quickly. They want implementation aids. These things are things like algorithms or patient decision aids or audit tools, and for example, so that it's easy to take those recommendations and implement them. And they wanted quicker updates because things change very rapidly now in medicine, especially in our specialty. They want the guidelines to be up to date and reflective of the state-of-the-art technologies and medicines that we're able to offer our patients. So really important that these the guidelines in dermatology can meet the demands of us as trainee dermatologists and practicing dermatologists, as well as a vast array of different clinicians ranging from maybe primary care practitioners, nursing staff, to even to patients who want to learn more about their own condition. So how can we find these CPGs? How do we know these CPGs are reliable so that we can go out and find recommendations to follow? So apart from maybe national societies that you would follow, there's not that much information out there. So the ECRI or the ECRI is an organization based in the States that used to look after the National Guidelines Clearinghouse, which was a trans or pan medicine type specialty guidelines repository. And if you click on ECRI, they still have some legacy entries under dermatology, and these are quite patchy. There are 58 guidelines. They have scorecards which tell you how good these guidelines are, but only about 32 out of the guidelines have some scorecards. These are only English CPGs, so not really a global resource. These guidelines are only available if the guideline development group or the GTGs agree to it. So potentially the poorer guidelines actually don't have an indication of their quality. And finally, they were not very accessible or intuitive to use. So if you go on this website, it's very difficult to find the guideline you want. It's not really organized based on disease or type. And so it's still very difficult to find the right resource. So I'm going to introduce two different groups and names to you, which may be indicators of quality, but also indicators of methodological robustness that guidelines developers should follow. So the first is a group called GRADE, and you may be you may have heard about GRADE because GRADE is now used across not only guidelines, but also systematic reviews. And GRADE stands for Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluation. And really, this kind of system of assessing evidence is designed to enable the translation of high quality evidence into recommendations. And this is because this is a system to rate the quality of a body of evidence based on an outcome. So rather than having different studies have different ratings of quality, it tries to answer a particular question. So let's say it's a question about what is the best treatment for alopecia areata, for example. Then it may be an outcome focus. So it may be what is the best treatment to reduce the SALT score to SALT 50 or whatever it is. Then this rating is applied to that particular outcome across the whole body of evidence. So it doesn't matter if you have poorer quality studies or better quality studies. It's about putting that body of evidence together to evaluate whether there is any certainty that we can follow a particular guidance, for example, using a particular treatment over another treatment. So it classes evidence by certainty. It takes into account some negative factors. So for example, risk of bias to the study, imprecision, which is whether we're confident of the actual estimate of effect, whether there's inconsistency, whether or not there's conflicting evidence, whether the evidence is indirect, so borrowed from another disease, maybe, for example, JAK inhibitor from rheumatoid arthritis studies rather than alopecia, for example, and whether there's publication bias, which is bias that could have been arisen because there is some publications that haven't been brought to light because of unfavorable, for example, outcomes. And then you have some positive factors that kind of upregulate or upweight the certainty. These are having a large effect, showing a dose response gradient and residual confounding that would decrease the effect. And these are kind of nitty gritty things that you don't need to know too much about, but this is some of the factors that come into the decision of rating of certainty. And one thing that's the GRADE system is very helpful for is it prompts the guideline development group to rate the outcomes of importance according to patients. So it's not only about what the experts think, it's also what outcomes are important to our patients. And these are rated higher and taken more into account for critical recommendations compared to the lower rated ones. So the other really important one that we'll talk about in a bit more detail is Agree To. And this is a whole system of both appraising guidelines, but also a checklist for reporting quality. And these things are often linked, but separate things. And Agree To very helpfully splits guidelines quality into 6 different domains, and these are the really important domains that we need to think about when we're looking at any guidelines. Firstly, scope and purpose. Does the guideline state what it's about, what clinical question it's trying to answer, who the guideline is designed for? Is it designed for children? Is it designed for adults? Is it designed to be used by primary care practitioners or by trainee dermatologists or whoever? So that needs to be clear. Did it take into account of all the stakeholders involved? Very importantly, patient views. Did it ask patients? Did it ask target users? For example, if you want primary care practitioners to use it, are there any primary care practitioners in the development group? Did they pilot it? development rigor. We'll come on to this in a bit more detail, but this is talking about how they put together the evidence. Did they use systematic reviews? Did they weigh up the risk and benefits? Did they link properly the evidence or recommendations, or is it a bit woolly? Maybe the evidence isn't poor, but they had very strong recommendations that they didn't explain. Did they externally review the recommendations? And this is a point we'll come on to later. Is it clear what we're supposed to do? Is it very easy to find the recommendations? Is there an algorithm to follow that's very clear and there's no ambiguity, and it kind of states the different scenarios? And this is often done better compared to the other domains. Is it applicable? Can we use these recommendations, or do they think about the facilitators and barriers? Do they recommend products or medicines that we can never get hold of in our country? How do we put this into practice? What is the implications of the resource? For example, if they recommend, a guideline recommends something that's really expensive, it's hard to get. Is it useful? And then the last one is contentious, the editorial independence. Are we sure that these guidelines are reliable? Are they created by people who are truly independent and following the evidence, or are they biased in some way? And this is often, we can think about this in terms of financial conflicts, in terms of industry involvement, but also there are also other different conflicts that we need to think about. So just to introduce our little project, we started a project called GuideMap, which stands for Global Guidelines in Dermatology Mapping Project, trying to answer some of these questions about putting guidelines together into one place so it's easily searchable, but also give an indicator of the quality so that people can go in and choose the right guideline for them to follow. And this has resulted in a couple of publications that I've indicated here. And there's also a website that I'll go on to later that you can find all this information. And a group of us really came together to try and answer some of these stakeholder questions and systematically search for and identify guidelines for an adapted list of skin conditions that have the highest disease burden globally. And I appreciate this is a bit old now. We based this on the Global Burden of Disease study in 2013. Many of the diseases are still of high burden, but we may now have new or changed estimates of burden now. But I've listed the conditions that we were interested in, and the ones in purple, I'm going to talk about these, the studies that we've completed. The ones in yellow, orange or yellow are the ones that we're working on at the moment, and all the other ones we're going to slowly get our head around and look at. So we're going to search for all these conditions, which we've already done, but then slowly critically appraise all the guidelines using validated tools. So first of all, we did the search, and you can see that we really covered quite a wide variety of quite a high number of different studies. So we searched and got over 17,000, and we whittled that down to 576 full text articles, a mammoth job that we looked at, and we included 137 from that. And we also hand searched all the guidelines in all the societies under the ILDS, and also in different search databases that aren't reproducible, such as Google search and GIN database, so on. And then we came up with a full number of 226 articles here. And so we had a look across the skin diseases at how many guidelines were written, and unsurprisingly, you get this high number for the conditions that are most prevalent in countries with the highest economical background. So melanoma, atopic dermatitis, these are very prevalent in the Western countries, and psoriasis. And you get a much more underrepresentation of the neglected tropical diseases such as scabies and tinea. And again, unsurprisingly, the majority of the guidelines we found were from countries of a high socio-demographic index, a huge amount from the Western countries, the US, UK, and Canada, and Europe, and much less when you look at other countries. Although we do have a couple from these other countries. This may be a problem with our search because we do have some guidelines that are under society paywall that we can't get hold of, but this is also an indicative of how much resource is in these countries and the bias towards these particular conditions. So when we look at different types of guidelines, you can roughly split them into treatment and diagnostic and prevention, and most guidelines are talking about treatments. We have some guidelines talking about diagnosis, but a lot less guidelines concentrating on prevention, which perhaps reflect the different diseases that are reflected in the number of guidelines there. And then we also looked at the burden of the disease measured by disease-affected life years, measured against the number of CPGs, and you can see an underrepresentation of some of the conditions underneath the line, so acne, scabies, cellulitis, and alopecia areata, and an overrepresentation of the conditions above the line, with atopic dermatitis, for example, and melanoma being highly represented. So those were the results from our scoping review, the first part of our study. I'm then going to go on to the critical appraisal parts, which is how we try to understand the quality of guidelines. And we use 3 different tools, of which the first one is the one that we already talked about, Agree-2, appraisal of guidelines for research and evaluation instrument. This is the only validated tool that we have used so far. The others are supplementary. So we've talked about the 6 domains already that we want to look at for guideline quality. So to ease our summary of our results, we use the traffic light system. So we designated domains as being excellent, above and equal to 70%, between 50 and 70 average, and then less than 50 poor. And what happens in Agree is that you have a platform on the website that all the members of the team go on to. There's then a calculation and a weighting where this gets averaged and put together, and you come up with a overall score for each domain. So I'm just going to go through the results. These are summarized in these 3 different publications listed here if you're interested to know more. So we have done the work for atopic dermatitis, psoriasis, and alopecia areata. We've got quite a few CPGs for atopic dermatitis and psoriasis, a lot less for alopecia areata at the time. Unfortunately, not that many CPGs scored excellent on all domains, being very robust. So we have 3 in atopic dermatitis and 5 under psoriasis, and none under alopecia areata. And very worryingly, 3 scored poor on all domains in the atopic dermatitis one. And if you want to know which ones they are, please go to the relevant paper, or you can go onto our website, which I'll flag up later. So what is the problem? What problem did we find? So these were the problems, and you can see a common theme. So firstly, stakeholder involvement was a problem in 2. So this is not involving patients enough in the GDG and in the decision-making process. Rigor of development, a problem across many different guidelines. Applicability not considering the barriers, for example, to implementation, often a problem. So just to remind ourselves what these things are, stakeholder involvement focuses on extent to which the guideline was developed by the appropriate stakeholders. Really, this is talking about patients, but it also is about maybe industry, maybe regulators, and all the other intended users of the guideline. Rigor of development talks about process. So is the process to gather, synthesize evidence, is that systematic? Did they become very clear when they talked about the link between that evidence and how they graded it to the recommendation and what they want to do with updating the evidence and the guideline? applicability? Did they really talk about and think through the barriers and facilitators to implementation, strategies to improve uptake, and what are the resource implications, especially if you want to use the guideline in another country? Are these treatment options or recommendations, are these accessible? So we're going to move to our second tool that we use. This is more for interest and less of a validated tool that you need to know of, but it's something that we use to highlight a certain other aspect of guidelines. And this is a set of red flags from an article by Lenz et al., which who is an investigative journalist who worked with some meta researchers. And these are the red flags that that group came up with that we also try to look at. And the ones highlighted in red are the ones that are extra to agree to, or the other tools that we're looking at in terms of what these red flags add. So this is really talking about, firstly, methodological quality, but secondly, biases in terms of financial or other conflicts of interest that may sway the recommendation formulation process. Firstly, talking about professional society that receives substantial industry funding, whether the whole guideline was supported by a company that is undeclared or hidden or out there, whether the chairs have any financial conflicts or whether panel members have any financial conflicts, and whether the committee can be stacked so that the majority of the guideline development group would be voting for a certain recommendation anyway, so that it preordains the recommendation, especially important for a controversial topic. And these things are very important, especially if the guidelines are not very good at talking about the link between evidence to recommendations, so that it's all a bit murky. How did they come up with this recommendation to use a particular drug? It may be a problem if there's any suggestion. This is very difficult to uncover, and I think we had real trouble trying to understand this. I think the other tools do have some evaluation of financial conflicts of interest, but it's more to do with how it's managed, whereas here it's very specific if there's any financial conflicts of interest. And for example, NICE is an organization in the UK who have very good methodology in putting together guidelines, and they often will stipulate that NICE committee chairs cannot have any conflict of interest in terms of personal or non-personal financial conflicts. So the other three we'll go on to later, but these other three of external review, expert in methodology, and inclusion of stakeholders we've already touched upon, and these are also evaluated with other tools. And so what did we find here? So unfortunately, again, a lot of the guidelines had quite a few red flags. There were a few with no red flags. So in the atopic dermatitis, 3 out of 40, 11 out of 33 in psoriasis, and unfortunately in alopecia areata, all had some red flags of one another. Often the red flag was actually for methodological things, such as no external review and no expert methodologists was also a problem in the atopic dermatitis one, as well as alopecia areata one. In the psoriasis one, they often had multiple panel members with financial conflicts, and there were little patient representatives or community stakeholders included, which is a problem for the recommendations and how to rate the outcomes. So moving on to the third one we used the criteria that was that was written by the Institute of Medicine. They have a little bit like a book, really, to guide what constitutes good, robust guideline development strategy. And in that article, they list out a list of between 8 to 9 criterion that we should look at. And these really map out pretty well to what we've already discussed in Agreed To, and also for red flags. So things like conflicts of interest, we've already talked about. Transparency, we've talked about. Composition of GDG, we've talked about. Systematic review intersection with guidelines. It has a bit more detail in this criteria of how the reviewers can interact with the guideline developers if they are different people. and then also how things should be done in terms of rating the recommendations, how they should be articulated, reviewed, and updated. So very, very similar and overlapping, but just adds a little bit more detail. And you won't be surprised to know we found very similar results. So again, not that many guidelines met all of the trustworthiness criteria that were listed out there. So one, the Malaysian one in atopic dermatitis review met all of them, but two met quite a few of them. In terms of psoriasis, we had three that had a majority of fully met criterion, whereas alopecia areata, I don't think any of the 6 guidelines had met all of the trustworthiness criteria. And it comes up again and again that in these reviews that external review and updating procedures was a problem in these guidelines. And we also have rating of strength of recommendations as a problem in the alopecia areata ones as well. So it'll be interesting and important to delve into what these mean. So why is external review important and what does it mean? So I think external review, as listed in the 7.1, 2, 3, and 4, is really trying to see if the guideline development group has sought a range of views outside of the narrow group. And this is really important because we can all be a bit blinkered in our thinking and interpret things according to our own experience. So it's really important to open this up. And so other groups with different perspectives can come in and challenge the recommendations. And really, there should be a transparent record of how this process was done, whether the comments from the external reviewers were considered, and what happened after that. Did this change the recommendations? Did this feed into the final publication? And for example, NICE is a good example. They always provide the draft to general public for comments with reasonable notice. So they're a good example of good practice in this area. It's really important also to call attention to political pressures and maybe other factors that may be coloring judgments, maybe provide suggestions about presentation and allow for debate. And really the key word here is transparency of the recommendations so that it can be trusted when it's used in the clinical setting. Updating is another important thing, and I already alluded to this earlier. I think all of us, all the stakeholders in terms of the BJD readership would appreciate guidelines that are updated. And it's important to be upfront as to how these guidelines are going to be updated. And the 8.1 to 8.3 guidance here from the IOM are more kind of nitty-gritty things that they should do. So they should publish they should put the publication date, the date of the evidence review. They should say how the literature is monitored and state when the guidelines should be updated when the new evidence suggests modification of clinically important recommendations. And so there's a list of things that the IOM have stated that may be useful in considering when guidelines should be updated. So these are listed here. These are pretty kind of common sense things where if you get evidence that's changed, if you have outcomes that now are considered important when it wasn't considered important before, where you have an increase in the number of available interventions, when the evidence has improved so that a better recommendations can be made, when different values have been placed on outcomes, and when resources have changed and become available for healthcare. These are all indicators of updating. But this field has really moved on, and I'm going to allude to this very quickly afterwards as well. So I'm just going to conclude with 2 slides, really. One slide is just to introduce you to our website that has put together some of that information so that it's easily searchable. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of resources ourselves to put this together. So the guideline functionality or guide map website itself is pretty rudimentary, but essentially we have grouped the guidelines that we have found by condition that you can click onto. So if you go onto this website, you can click onto and find the guidelines by different conditions. And for the ones that we have assessed for guideline quality, you can see our little blobs of traffic light colors, which each blob represents one of the domains from 1 to 6, and you used to be able to hover over it and remind yourself which domain is which. We're just working on that at the moment, but then you can just scroll through and have a look. And of course, most people practice based on their own society's guidelines. But here, for example, you can see that, for example, the Belgium and Brazilian guidelines are not great in terms of certain domains, and you may want to have a look at the other guidelines also under this under psoriasis to get an idea of whether the recommendations are robust. So just an overview of the situation then. Are dermatology clinical practice guidelines reliable? And we have to say there are reliable guidelines, but not many. And it does seem to be the case that there is an improvement over time in the quality of guidelines, but we still have to be very vigilant. And now you know what to look out for. Think about these issues when you look at a guideline to follow. And there does seem to be a lack of focus on neglected tropical diseases, and this is an area that the community should think about, especially in terms of the lack of, for example, prevention and diagnosis guidelines. I think this is an area that the community should look to produce more guidelines to guide clinical practice. So I talked about updating, and now there's a move to instead of just updating at a certain predefined time point, let's say 5 years, when there's changes in the evidence, there's now a move to living guidelines where you have constant monthly or 2-monthly searches of the evidence, and certain rules will trigger an update, not of the whole guideline, but of certain recommendations, so that each time you go online to look at the guidelines, it will be up to date to maybe the last month. And this is really important now with the rapid change in the number of treatments that is open to us in dermatology. Is important to have very, very updated guidelines, and this movement towards living guidelines and living systematic reviews that are shared between different guidelines is really important, again, to try and avoid research waste. So in psoriasis now, there's a move to just base all the guidelines on the evidence generated by the Cochrane review, which is a living systematic review. And we can then rely on that and not repeat the process and the effort that has gone into putting that together into a network meta-analysis, but the guidelines can then adapt that to fit their own scope and also whatever healthcare system the guideline is intended to work for. There's also a big move to adapt rather than reproduce. So I've already alluded to the fact that most guidelines are actually based on the same type of evidence. It's the same papers that get cited. So rather than doing the whole process again, where someone's already come together and done a robust set of recommendations, it may be better just to use a formal adaptation process to ones that are done that are robust, and then adapt them to your own healthcare setting. And this again can reduce research waste, but also enable very robust recommendations. We've identified very specific things that GDGs can do. So if you currently in a guidelines development group or will be invited or go on to a guidelines development group in the future, please bear these things in mind and make sure that the group thinks about these things. Firstly is thinking about having a methodologist on the panel. I know easier said than done, not that many methodologists around, and they also cost a bit as well, but it's important to have someone who has methodological expertise in putting the data together. Remember to think about external review. Remember to think about using something like grade methodology is isn't the only methodology, but it's one of the best and most commonly used ones for guidelines. Remember about reporting according to Agree 2. Remember to do a process to include as many stakeholders as possible, but also in particular patients and public, so that they can rate the outcomes, so that the outcomes are not just focused on things that are important to clinicians. Remember to think about barriers and facilitators of your recommendations when you're articulating these recommendations. Remember to think about implementing, how you can make implementing the guidelines easier. So, for example, using decision aids to help share decision making between the patient and clinician, and also managing conflicts of interest is a very important thing to think about. So I think this is my last content slide. It's just to go back to the concept of evidence-based medicine and evidence-based dermatology that we're interested in. And really, guidelines is one of the kind of final steps between linking evidence into our clinical practice. It's really important that we are taking into account not only of the evidence, but there's also a very important element of patient values that hopefully should have been incorporated in the guidelines, but is going to be personal to the patient that you're seeing in front of you. So remember to include that, as well as the clinical experience. So guidelines are not tramlines. They are not rigid and fixed. They are something to help you in kind of taking and pulling the evidence into your clinical practice, but they will not be always applicable. So it's very, very important in evidence-based practice to take into account of your own clinical experience in implementing the guideline recommendations. So with that, I'd like to conclude my talk. So just want to really thank the GuideMap team. So a couple of people to call out. William Hall is the registrar who was responsible for the scoping review, did a lot of the work to put that together. We couldn't have done the first couple of slides without him. Also, Leila Asfor led the critical appraisal one for alopecia areata, Bern Arndt and Esther Van Zuren, the atopic dermatitis one, Kevin Yen and Qingqi Chi from Taiwan for the psoriasis one. So they've been instrumental in putting that data together. And we're also very lucky to have two patient representatives on our team as well, Amy Johnson, who helped us with the alopecia areata guideline, and Bernard Arndt, who is also a patient who helped us with the review of the AD guidelines as well. So thank you very much for listening. My email and Twitter handle is there. We are gonna move very soon to look at tinea, and so if you're interested to help us, Sidra Khan, who you will know, I don't know if she's on the call, will be interested in leading this, so feel free to contact her or contact me if you're interested in joining our team and helping us out. So thank you very much for listening and participating.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zenas Yiu. That was a very informative presentation. I'm sure that everyone is trying to understand about clinical guidelines now. I think, so now it's 10 minutes to 1 o'clock. Oh, it's a bit hard to tell from my different time zone, but we have 10 minutes left. So we'll probably have time for 2 or 3 questions. So I'm just going to start off with first questions. I'm generally very curious, like I didn't know about this guide map that we can search for clinical guidelines. So I had a quick look, and you basically put down some of the countries, let's say like Singapore International. How did you come up with the certain one? Like, why would you pick that one as the guideline instead of like some others? Because I would think that UK might have quite a few. Why did you only pick that one as a representative?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to our strategy really. So we had we pre-specified our search strategy. And one thing that is really surprisingly hard to define is what is a guideline. It's actually surprising to many papers do not state they are guidelines. They sometimes state they are consensus statements. And if you go back to our definition from the IOM, it states that guidelines are recommendations that should be driven by systematic review of evidence. It's very difficult often to assess whether a guideline group has done this systematically if they haven't told us. And so we had to really kind of broaden our definition a little bit and say, you know, if we can find that there is some evidence that they search for the evidence, and somehow you can they have done the synthesis of evidence, then we say yes, we count that as a guideline. So that's one of the steps that probably filtered out a lot of guidelines, because they didn't tell us there were guidelines, and they didn't tell us they put this together. And then it's about whether we can access them. So we had a very long process of searching for all the society websites on the ILDS. You can imagine that took us ages. A lot of the societies have their guidelines under paywall, and just we couldn't access them because we weren't society members. So then we weren't able to include those ones. So it wasn't a case of selecting. I think it's just how we performed our search. In the end, these were the ones that we could find and put together, and we tried to be as comprehensive as possible to include as many possible, but we also limited the search window to 5 years, because, you know, if you do 10, 15 years, we have hundreds more guidelines, and often these guidelines aren't actually, you know, relevant anyway, especially in fast moving areas where, you know, in 5 years, I think things have changed.
Yep. And then the language wise, would you, because like some other countries in low and middle country will not be in English most of the time, it's this just mainly in English, is that right?
No, actually, we tried our best. We relied heavily on Google Translate. So Google Translate is very helpful for the scoping, because you know, it can pick up the ones that have the basic information so that we can include them. So I think we have included translations, but also just the link to their language. So for example, the Japanese guidelines are often not in English, or the English is hard to find. So we relied a lot on the Google Translate for that. We did have help for the Thai guidelines for some translations, and we also had, I can't remember, for some other languages, we also had some help. And also we have an international group. So we have Chinese, we have people from Netherlands, we have some, but of course we won't be able to look at all of them. So Russian was a particular problem for us. So I think our results are very reliable in terms of comprehensiveness, because we included those. But in terms of critical appraisal, that is a problem, because I think some things can often be lost in translation in using Google Translate. So I think you do have to take our evidence evaluations of those with a pinch of salt, and hopefully we can get more global members to help us, but it is difficult.
I was just thinking about, if you need some help in Portuguese, I can do that.
Always very welcome.
yes, because I was imagining you should have like a partner from each country, you know, who speaks the language. And for example, in Brazil, I have access to the guidelines. So
that would be amazing. Yeah, that would be amazing.
I think maybe we have like 2 more questions, Aswan. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think there's a person, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Tozadova. Mentioned that just asking the question, how do you ensure that your patient involvement is also diverse, as the experiences may be very unique?
That's a really good question, and I think it is difficult to ensure that it is relevant to all patients, but you can do some things. So first of all, I think the main thing is having patients. I think that's the first step, and you can see that for guidelines, it often doesn't include any patients. So patients should be involved right from the outset in the guideline development group in setting out the outcomes and how critical they are, but also looking through the evidence and helping us interpret that in terms of what is important to patients. Now, in terms of how can you include a diverse array of opinions, I think there's a couple of things that people used to do. One is rely on patient societies, and we have very good patient societies in dermatology. Global Skin, I know many patient societies are a member of Global Skin. They are kind of our ILDS kind of equivalent, I guess, for patient societies, and they have a really good reach into the different patient populations. Your national patient societies, some have really strong ones, others don't. So it's much easier if you do have strong ones. Nowadays, social media, really easy. You can get opinions from across a lot of different people, some so more useful than others, but you certainly can get a diverse array of opinions. And then what we've done with the recent methotrexate guideline is try and do all of that in sending out a survey right at the beginning to include all the patient societies and to as much kind of experience as possible, not only patients, but also carers, also pharmacists, primary care practitioners, nurses, everyone involved, so that you get that diverse opinion, so that it's hopefully as representative of all the stakeholders as possible. But patient is elevated above everyone else in the grade process. So it's very important to include those.
Thank you. I think we can have one more question. So, so how do you overcome differences in the accessibility to treatment in global guidelines?
Yeah, I don't think this is an easy one that we could do from our research team point of view. I think what this does is highlight discrepancies between guidelines by putting it together. And I think the role with making the recommendations applicable is the GDG's responsibility. And if they cannot access a certain treatment, then it's escalating that to policymakers and even global policymakers such as the WHO and other. I think the great thing about GDGs and guidelines, it can flag up these issues so that more work can be done to identify discrepancies and take them to the relevant people. But really, the people who can solve this are policymakers globally and in your country.
Thank you very much. I will. I think it's about time. I will throw back to Louisa.
So I think we would just like to thank you, Dr. Zenas. It was amazing. Very clarifying. It's a really interesting subject. I don't know if it left me with more doubts, because it's really hard to overcome the problems. But I think you're at least trying, you and your team. So thank you very much for your work and your lecture. And if you need help with Portuguese, I can always help you. I'll email you. And I think that's it. We would like to, thank you. And hopefully everyone else felt the same way. And I think it was very clarifying, because it's a theme that we don't really see in residency. We don't really have access. So it was excellent.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.